An asset is something that physical asset I have in my hand. Debt is something I might get. All right. But debt is also something that I can create at will, unlike a physical asset. It requires capital and labor. So probably that's the most dangerous form of monetary unit that you could ever imagine, is one that can be created at will, especially when politicians are doing the creating. So here we have a homeland security problem just in principle. An unstable monetary system undermines the stability of the productive structure. If the productive structure is undermined and you have some kind of economic collapse, catastrophe, what have you, it could be hyperinflationary, the money blowing out, price increases, or it could be depressionary, people being driven out of work and production ceasing. You're going to destabilize the society not only economically, but socially, and then politically. I'll give you the example of Germany in 1923. Germany had lost the war, the First World War. And they had a semi-socialist government, and they had a lot of debt that they owed under the Versailles Treaty. And that government engaged in some rather massive inflationary episodes. June of 1923, they'd already had a great deal of inflation up to that point. Aid cost about 80,000 marks. By the end of November 1923, an aid cost about $1 trillion marks. They blew it out in 6 months. The next week, first week in December, that monetary system was gone, and they were very fortunate that the rest of the world was on a more or less stable monetary system because Germany could now interact with the rest of the world, reorganize its financial structure. But what's fascinating is that period of time, that 6 months, that system kept operating and kept generating those prices until it finally collapsed. Right? So if it could happen in one of the most sophisticated countries in the West, and certainly Germany was that at the time, it could happen anywhere. And what was one of the great consequences of that Weimar inflation? It was the social and political instability that led to the communist, Nazi fight and eventually the takeover by Hitler. And almost any economist, historian of that period says this was one of the direct causes to the rise of Hitler. I mean, they could have ended up with a communist dictator. They were going to get a dictator, but they ended up with Hitler. And that was the whole world. 75 million people died as a result of that. Okay. So there are serious consequences to this. And we now look at our system, Federal Reserve being inherently unstable. And we see an important difference between the context now and the context in 23 in Germany. In 23 in Germany, there were other countries that were still on a stable monetary system. Britain, France for that matter, the United States, they were on a so-called gold standard. So the Germans were capable of using prices from the outside. They were capable of getting loans if they needed it in a sound currency when theirs collapsed. Today, the entire world is on a fiat currency system. There's not a single country in the world that has a truly economically sound currency. So if the Federal Reserve System comes down, the Federal Reserve System is a world reserve currency system because of the Bretton Woods Agreement after World War II. There will be shocks that will extend across the globe. Nobody knows what the consequences are. All right, so here we have this problem. Now, how do we put these two things together? Because obviously Washington is not solving the monetary problem, they're making it worse. And they have to make it worse, that's the only way they'll maintain their power. The bankers and the speculators on Wall Street with whom they're interlocked, and the politicians who are their clients or vice versa, cannot maintain their position politically and economically if this system of theirs goes down, because their power is based upon that system. So they will never change it to your benefit. They will change it in some way that preserves as much as possible their control, and they'll make you pay for that. So now we have to imagine, you don't need much imagination, to see the breakdown of the monetary system coming. It creates a homeland security problem. And we don't have the institutions that the Constitution requires us to have to deal with this problem, that is, the militia. Well, leaving that aside for a moment, how could you deal with this problem? Well, one thing you can't do is you simply can't introduce a new money tomorrow morning, Congress couldn't pass a statute and say, well, tomorrow we're going to have this new red currency. Give it some other name. Mainly because of what? The market price structure. The market price structure is all denominated in these Federal Reserve units. They call them dollars, but people pay in Federal Reserve units. And you can't simply change that structure overnight. Who would know what a loaf of bread should cost in this new pink currency? And if Congress gives you those numbers, that's total socialistic planning, and then the thing comes down entirely. Right? So it can't be done that way. You have to create a system of alternative or parallel currencies. The sound currency on one side, the Federal Reserve currency on the other. Put this one into the market. Let the marketplace start using this one and develop a price structure based upon this one. And as the market sees that this alternative is superior to this one, more and more resources flow away from the Federal Reserve side of the system into the sound currency side of the system, and eventually the Federal Reserve currency just disappears. And some of those banks survive and some of those banks don't, but that's whose problem? Their problem, not my problem, not your problem. So this will take a certain amount of time, quite obviously. It needs a certain amount of stability. You can't have politicians mucking around with this as it's going along. You have to set up and let it go. And you have to have a lot of people participating in it, because there are a lot of prices to change and a lot of price relationships to change in production and consumption. So if you could make everyone participate in this tomorrow, you might get it done in 6 months. But you can't get everyone to participate in this tomorrow, because most people don't understand this. Just like in Germany in 1923, in June, they will continue to hang on to that paper currency until it finally collapses around their head. And I've had people tell me this over and over again. Why do I care about reforming the Federal Reserve System as long as I can continue to use the money? As long as I can continue to go to Walmart and buy Chinese goods that are destroying the productive basis of this country, I'm happy. Now, going to Walmart and buying those goods should be a grounds for dealing with this person. But I say, look, in Germany, it was the working of the system that destroyed the country. Remember? They kept using this until the very end. If they had stopped in June, they would have been much better off than in November. But the average person, by inertia primarily, will cling to one of these systems, because this is what he knows, until finally it destroys itself from underneath him. So there's your first problem. It's public education. Most people don't understand how the banks work, how money works. And they certainly would not understand, at least immediately, how a process of exchanging one form of currency for another would work. Although it happened recently, that's what the Europeans did with the euro. They introduced this thing called the euro that came out of nowhere, something invented. They set up dual price structures in each country, so you have the lira versus the euro, the peseta versus the euro, the franc versus the euro, the mark versus the euro. They let those countries equilibrate their price structure, and then they began to withdraw the local currency, the national currency, from the system, so the system would end up using only euros. So you see that it works. It's not very hard to understand how it will work. But in that particular system, they didn't have a crisis, number one. They had general agreement of all of the subsidiary states to do this. And the Europeans, much more so than the Americans, were used to dealing with multiple currencies, because all those little countries were right next to each other. And they were dealing with each other, so they knew how to price things in different forms of currency, certainly when they were engaged in cross-border trade, right? But we don't have much of that cross-border trade in this country that the average American is aware of. So there's the problem. All right, so it's certainly possible for the average American individually to back out of the Federal Reserve System. Stop using Federal Reserve notes. Start asking to be paid in gold and silver. Start offering to pay gold and silver. Start writing what used to be called gold clause contracts. All perfectly legal, but difficult. A lot of cost involved. You may be educated, but it takes two to make a contract. You have to educate that other person. And then you have to educate, if you're in business, you have to educate his lawyer, and his accountant, and his tax advisor, right? Maybe his wife. I mean, you go down and list of these people have to be educated before they'll agree to do it, because it's so alien to what they're doing now. Then there are costs involved, because there are not gold and silver banks out there.